Welcome back. President Trump says he talked to Vladimir Putin for more than an hour today about Ukraine's drone strikes on air bases deep inside Russia, among a whole slate of other things. The president posting on Truth Social, quote, "It was a good conversation, but not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace." President Putin did say, and very strongly, he will have to respond to the recent attacks on the airfields. Let's bring in State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce. Tammy, thanks for taking time with us this afternoon.
My pleasure.
I guess in response to the post on Truth Social from the president, why is he broadcasting Russia's next move?
Well, the president has always been transparent. He feels that the governance of this country, of course, belongs to every American. That is part, of course, of his remarkable success. Is what President Trump is thinking. You know why he does what he does. This is an existential matter. It is something that has been very public. He made his opinion about President Putin also very clear a couple of weeks ago, when, even sooner than that, saying he didn't know what happened to him. And he was furious about the nature of Russia sending rockets into Ukraine, killing civilians, killing innocent people. Now, this phone call obviously touched on a number of issues. I was not there. I'm not going to characterize it, but I have to say that it is perhaps the least optimistic I've heard him regarding the nature of what was possible in a phone call and the peace or ceasefire with Ukraine. But this is part of, obviously, negotiations. It is part of the diplomatic effort, the nature of conversations between people who can make the difference. President Trump knows President Putin clearly over time. He clearly has made obvious his opinion of him at this point, and he continues to make the difference. He continues to try to get to peace. And I think that this is the framework that we expect from President Trump. It's why he's successful. It's why Americans trust him as they should. And it's why if anybody can get this done, it will be President Trump. But he also noted about Iran that he thought Iran was slow walking the particular negotiations we're having with them, and that their time is running out. I would think that President Putin knows exactly where President Trump stands, and that will help, I believe, in the nature of how we proceed with Ukraine.
To that point, the Iran negotiations, something that caught my eye in the president's post was he also said that he thinks Putin might be able to be helpful, he said, in the negotiations with Iran. Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Well, again, I don't want to characterize or speculate on what that means. This is a situation where the president's obviously open with the American people and with his thoughts here. And for some reason, he believes within that relationship that might be possible. And we'll see how that might unfold. But this is one of the reasons why President Trump matters so much, and why we believe he can get things done, because of his relationships with people and his willingness to talk with everyone and to use whatever tools he has in that tool chest, whatever mechanisms he has as the president of the United States, to make sure everyone around the world knows that America is back, that the president is serious, that we're going to do what we need to make America safer. And the way to do that is to make the world safer. And that, I believe, is what drives him and will make the difference here.
A lot of people have been asking me lately, Tammy, in my line of work in Washington, covering State Department, but also just friends and people I know outside of work, what the difference is between now and 8 years ago in terms of Iran and the negotiations that are ongoing. We have a president who's threatening to use financial sanctions, at the same time sitting down to try and ink a nuclear deal. What's the real difference between this and Iran 1.0 with President Obama?
Well, I think that what changed the world was October 7th. And it reminded the world of the danger that Jews face, not just in Israel, but around the world. The fact there was a ceasefire at that point, and that Israel has been surrounded by death squads funded by, supported by Iran. We know that Iran, as America rightly states, is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. We know what they've done in the past. We know what they've continued to do in that region. Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, that you're looking at cancers in that region that exist to destabilize, to murder, to maintain a kind of chaos that allows Iran to continue to survive. It is clear after October 7th and Israel defending itself that Hamas, as we've also stated, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio has stated, Hamas cannot continue to exist. Israel has a right to defend itself, and they are going to do what every sovereign nation has a right to do, which is defend themselves in the midst of any kind of attack, let alone massive terror attacks. The same with Hezbollah. The Israeli response to that continued effort by Hezbollah, also a death squad of Iran, with, as an example, their what's known as the beeper action, taking out just the terrorists in the midst of what they needed to do to defend their borders. And, of course, our actions against the Houthis, what Israel will do regarding the Houthis in Yemen to protect that flank as well. Iran is on its heels, Jillian. It is clear. Their economy is in a desperate situation. And that is what it is that makes this different. And President Trump knows the differences now, learning from the first administration to now when it comes to how quickly we need to get things done and the tools he needs to use.
Let's hope the Iranians feel that pain at home. Tammy, or the officials, not Iran citizens. Before I let you go, I want to ask you about this story about these Chinese would-be agro-terrorists who were luckily apprehended.
Yes.
Before now, where did agro warfare kind of like rank in your list of things that keep you up at night? Seems kind of
well, you know, I know, look, when it comes to all different kinds of warfare, right? Biological warfare, the nature of what happened with COVID, the nature of decisions that are made by people, or even through a natural framework. We are learning a lot about the world. And in this particular case, I think what's important to remember is that when Secretary Rubio is making his points about visas and the president about the border, the importance of securing the nation at borders and when it comes to who comes in and who we allow to stay or who we kick out becomes much more clear. The secretary sometimes has been mocked or derided regarding visa issues and the vetting that we need to do regarding who comes into the country. There are many examples, of course, recently, if not all the time. This is an example of why we must be careful and disciplined about the nature of who we let in, what we look for, what we accept, to not look away, to not get undisciplined about keeping this nation safe. This is one example. There are so many more as we move further into the 21st century. But this is an attitude that keeps Americans safe, America safer as a nation, and also reminds people in the world of what people are capable of doing. We've seen it, of course, in Colorado. We see it in this instance. We saw it on October 7th. This is our generation, Jillian, is the generation that will say enough is enough and that everyone deserves peace. The world deserves to be at peace. President Trump leads us to that, and Secretary Rubio, of course, implements that policy.
All right. We know it's an extra busy day for you today in Washington. Tammy, thank you so much for taking time with us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.